Welcome back. And as was mentioned earlier, the first segment is actually a recorded interview that I conducted on Friday in Guatemala City with Prime Minister Dean Barrow. He was there to attend the inauguration of the Guatemalan President Jimmy Morales. And we took the opportunity to sit down and talk with him about primarily Belize-Guatemala relations and what it means with the new president. And a number of other issues. But the bulk of this portion of the interview will be about Belize-Guatemala relations. So let's take a look at that now. Good morning, Prime Minister.
Good
I want to
morning.
say thank you for taking the time while you're here in Guatemala
Not
City
at
to
all,
sit down
ma'am.
with me.
Pleasure.
Now, obviously diving into the purpose why we are here for the inauguration of President Jimmy Morales, I want to start off by just talking about your expectations of what the relations will be like under his presidency.
Actually, I am extremely optimistic, extremely hopeful. We know that there were some little hiccups right at the start, just after he'd been elected. But I think we got over those very quickly. And when he came to Belize as part of his regional tour as president-elect, we got along well, and both of us engaged in some straight talk about what we expected from the relations. I was reassured then, and even more reassured yesterday to see that in his inaugural address, he referred to the relations with Belize and indicated that he wished to see the dispute settled, and he wished to pursue good neighborly relations with Belize. So I am extremely encouraged.
Yeah. I had an interview 2 days ago with Foreign Minister Carlos Raul Morales, and I asked him specifically about the issue of the forward operating base that was built on the banks of the Sarstoon. Now,
It's finished already?
Well, the breaking
Started.
ground, thank you. What he communicated to us was that the decision to move to the banks of the Sarstoon was one that was done mutually because of the claims that Guatemala has on Sarstoon Island as well. Can you address that issue? Because that was not what was communicated to us in Belize.
Well, I'm not quite sure what he means. There may well have been discussions between him and our foreign minister that I didn't participate in, and I don't want to say what may or may not have taken place during those discussions, what may or may not have said. All I know is that while we had first looked at the actual island in the middle of the Sarstoon, that was thought from an operational, from a logistical point of view, not to make much sense. So that even before there was the hue and cry on the part of the Guatemalans, we had pretty much come to the conclusion that we would have to build the base on the mainland, as it were, on our bank of the Sarstoon. But quite frankly, while the principal motivation for the change in location did not have to do with the protest from Guatemala, I freely concede that in the circumstances it is just as well that we did not seek to proceed with the island. In the circumstances, I don't know that anything was lost in consequence of the change of location, and if that change as a sort of byproduct of a decision that was made for operational purposes also succeeded in not increasing, not escalating any tensions between ourselves and Guatemala, then that is to be welcomed.
Now, this also, it really comes back to the issue of the Belizean public's concern in our relationship with Guatemala and what has been described very often as what seems to be an appeasement when engaging in matters of this kind. Your foreign minister, our foreign minister, Wilfred Sedu-Elrington, had been heavily criticized prior to the elections, and you reappointed him once again to that post. What do you say in terms of the concerns that the people have in our engagement with issues when it relates to Guatemala on a diplomatic level?
I understand this is such a fundamentally emotive issue for our people that any moves that are made, any developments that occur in the relations between the two countries are put under a microscope, and that is how it has to be, and perhaps that is how it should be. I also understand, excuse me, that people in Belize can't be expected to look at this issue through the prism of diplomacy and of balance and of the art of the possible. But where the foreign minister is concerned, he's extremely experienced. He's had long years now on the international circuit generally, and as perhaps the central player on Belize's side, from Belize's side, in the relations with Guatemala. And I am absolutely satisfied that he knows what he's doing. I'm also satisfied that he is very much prepared to suffer the slings and arrows of the attacks that are launched on a regular basis against him, because he's mature enough to recognize that since, as I said and as we all know, this is such a hinge issue for our people, so existential, that they are not going to be prepared to give any with respect to the back and forth and the dialogue that takes place between Belize and Guatemala. Ultimately, the foreign minister is not going to do anything that compromises Belize's position. As a matter of his own instinct, as a matter of his own patriotism, as a matter of his own good sense. And in any event, there is a government of which he's a part, to which he's responsible, and the government will not allow anything to happen that constitutes any kind of fundamental slippage in terms of maintaining Belize's position. But subject to that ultimate backstop, the dialogue, the discussions, the negotiations must involve some degree of give and take, some degree of back and forth. We who are charged with maintaining Belize's territory intact, keeping always in the forefront of our mind the national interests of the country, are completely conscious of our charge and the need to discharge that charge in a way that ultimately will safeguard the national well-being. So if in doing that and if in attempting to achieve that ultimate objective, there are times when we tack and we move to one side or we move to another as part of the strategy for in the larger scheme of things, and people don't immediately understand where we're coming from in terms of the long game, then it is our duty to try to say to them, look, we hear where you're coming from, but believe us, we know what we're doing and we're not ever going to give away the store. That's how I suspect it will continue to operate, where the general public or certainly elements of the populace will not always see with every move that is made. I am satisfied, I am absolutely certain that we will, as I say, never do anything that will fundamentally prejudice the well-being of Belize. And we operate
You
on
describe
that
the
basis.
issue as a motive for Belizeans, and rightly so. We've seen quite a reaction anytime there is any incident that takes place regarding Guatemala. Would you say that the education campaign on this issue has failed, given the reaction of Belizeans and the understanding or the current temperament on this issue?
Well, when we talk about the education campaign, if we're talking about the education campaign in terms of the referendum process and the agreement
resolution of the dispute,
to resolve the dispute by way of going to the ICJ, I don't know that I would say that the campaign has failed. It is a campaign that was not particularly long-lasting, because while we started off with a bang, in a sense we ended with a whimper, simply because on the part of Guatemala it turned out that there was not the preparedness to go to the referendum at the time when we had both contemplated we would mutually and simultaneously do so. Thereafter, the urgency for a full tilt education campaign lessened. But in any event, Marlene, no matter how much we try to say to people, this is what is involved, these are what the stakes are, and here are the modalities under which Belize must operate. You're never going to ever be able to remove the readiness to be suspicious of what the government does and of the trajectory that's supposed to lead to the referendum. There are times when it is worrying, but at the end of the day, I have no difficulty with it. I've said to you that we are quite conscious that we ought not, cannot, and will not do anything wrong. But that absolute, the fervent way in which especially the radicals at home go at this issue, to some extent serves a useful purpose. It keeps the government honest. In my view, we're always going to be honest, but in a sense, that is an extra layer of motivation for us, an extra layer of, however contradictory it might seem, support while they are opposing particular things that we're doing.
Given the fact that your administration initiated this process, the signing of the compromise in 2008, the process
started even before that.
Yes, the process started from long before that. The compromise was signed under your administration. The amendment was signed last year. It still awaits approval here in Guatemala. However, what is your commitment, given that we knew in 2008 the elections in Belize and Guatemala were pending and that most actions wouldn't be formalized until after that? Now that we are at this junction, how committed are you to carrying out during your term? And what is the timeline for the referendum?
Committed, but not especially preoccupied with the timeline. I would hope that it can be sooner rather than later, but President Morales is obviously going to have an extremely difficult time when you look at the makeup of Congress and when you look at the huge issues that confront him. He can't move without Congress. Congress is fractious, Congress is divided, so I'm not going to hold my breath in terms of thinking that we can move to the referendum and hopefully thereafter to the ICJ.
Would you like to see the referendum held in Belize before your term as Prime Minister is up?
I would, but I'm saying it's not something that obsesses me. I am more concerned with ensuring that the relations between the two countries, while we are awaiting the holding of the referendum, that those relations continue on a basis of good neighborliness, of mutual restraint, mutual respect, and a willingness to develop the people-to-people contact, the trade links, and work the confidence-building measures in such a way that we can avoid flashpoints. For me, that is job one.
All right, and there you had the first portion of that interview. And as I pointed out, the conversation was primarily about Belize-Guatemala relations and his expectations with the new president in place.
And I think the big challenge is always how do you straddle that line between what kind of rhetoric locally you'd want and globally what you need to do in terms of diplomacy. And I think because of the instantaneous nature of communications now with the internet, it's a situation where you have to be even more guarded with what you say to make sure that it doesn't impact the global picture. But I think that's a hard balance to strike for anybody who's in that position. But then vocabulary and semantics becomes really, really important.
Yeah. You know, I keep underscoring, you know, one of the things that is very evident in any travel that you make to Guatemala, whether for work or your own personal time, it's not a major issue for them. You know, they have really substantial, and if anyone had seen the inaugural speech by President Jim Morales, you know, there's 15 seconds of a mention of Belize, and the majority of it was really addressing their main social issues. They have quite a bit to deal with there, and Belize isn't necessarily on the radar as much as Guatemala is an issue for us, which means that our government representatives have to respond to it far more often and carefully than their counterparts in Guatemala on the particular issue. So it is something that, of course, the foreign minister says every time we interview him, but I can tell you from on the ground, and even speaking with other people when you're there, it's not a front burner issue for them. Nonetheless, I think one of the things that the Prime Minister said that was very interesting is really looking at the timeline for the referendum. And at this point, you know, neither sides have committed, neither countries have committed to a date. In fact, the amendment that was made last year still has to go to Congress in Guatemala to be approved. So there's still some more steps to take. And if we recall, when the compromise was signed back in 2008, one of the things that was told to us by the people involved was this was a 5 to 7 year process at least. And it seemed very long at that point, but now look at us.
7 years
Exactly.
and counting.
Yeah. So they were very right, and all the issues that were laid out as to why it would be 5 to 7 years panned out exactly as was said. Now that the two elections are over and both have a full term, it really is a good time to be able to maximize if it is a priority for the governments in both countries. So we'll see. As I pointed out, the second part of this interview will air tomorrow morning, and that's where we look at some of the regional issues. We look at integration with CARICOM and SICA, and we look at Prime Minister Barrow weighing in on the leadership of the People's United Party and also the UDP, and of course the relationship with investors in the country. So that's coming up tomorrow morning as a follow-up or the conclusion of this particular interview. What we're going to do now
is go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by representatives from SMART, and then we'll jump directly into a conversation about Chicky Bull. Don't go anywhere. Open your eyes. Continue after these messages.